And thanks for staying on. The Newsfeed Late Night continues, and tonight in conversation broadly with those who are participating in the South African economy as the country's business and economy work towards recovery from the effects of the coronavirus pandemic. Is broad-based black economic empowerment due for a recalibration? Joining me to talk about this is Black Business Council President and Amazulu FC Chair Sandile Zungu, Free State University Chancellor and Bidvest Independent Non-Executive Chair, Professor Bonang Mohale, writer and analyst at the Institute of Race Relations, Gabriel Crouse, and the CEO of the Pietermaritzburg and Midlands Chamber of Business, Melanie, Veness. Now, to be a part of the conversation, tag us now on Twitter at Newsroom405. WhatsApp your questions and your comments to 072 554. The question is the BEE policy due for a recalibration? Gentlemen and lady, good evening and thank you very much for your time tonight. Prof, I'll start with you with that exact question. Looking at when the policy was to be put in place in 2003, right? The idea was we need this economy transformed, and much of it also including the black people who are in the majority, and therefore we come up with this policy. We didn't tell the market how that policy is supposed to be implemented. In 2007, we woke up and said, hold on, let's come up with codes of good practice. Let's help these people understand what needs to be done. Even that did not give us the results. We look at 2013, we say, okay, let's put in place now a regulator that is going to police these people and ensure that they are dealing with these issues that we say they must deal with. Well, with the regulator in place in 2015, 2017, we still saw a reversal in terms of ownership from well over 30% to just under 27%. Is the policy working, and is it time to have it recalibrated?
Babu Mdluli, thank you for having me. I think what the pandemic has done is to demonstrate beyond any shadow of doubt that if ever broad-based black economic empowerment is needed, it is now more than at any other time in the history of this 27-year-old democracy. When we say we have taken over from Brazil as the most unequal society in the world with a Gini coefficient of almost 0.6, we are talking about income inequality. We don't include wealth inequality, let alone asset inequality. When you include those, you'll see that black people and women absolutely stand no chance, because we have done nothing to reverse the apartheid spatial planning, where black people are still on average 40 kilometers away from their places of work. They spend on average 40 minutes to go to work, another 40 minutes to come back, and it chews up almost 40% of their meager salary. If we include food, that's 70%. I mean, as business, how do we send our people home to say go and work from home in Soweto, where there's 3.5 million people, more than the population of Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, and Eswatini? Only 2 bedrooms, one for parents, one for girls. The quietest and safest place is the toilet. And you say, do social distancing. How? Do self-quarantine if you have been exposed. How will you do it? When we say people, you must wash your hands with running water and soap for at least 20 seconds, and yet the majority of schools in Eastern Cape and Limpopo still don't have running water. We had a budget of 500 million to put in JoJo's. It is more expensive than the permanent solution of putting taps. I think, for me, broad-based black economic empowerment is needed now, because it is a planned and positive process and strategy that is aimed at transforming the socio-economic environments that have excluded individuals from previously disadvantaged groups, in order for these individuals to gain access to opportunities, including developmental opportunities based on their suitability.
Now, a couple of months ago,
that our children every year go.
I'm saying, Prof, a couple of months ago, the president stressed that particular point as well, and he said, well, the policy is here to stay. it's not going anywhere. So assuming indeed that the policy is here to stay and is not going anywhere, let's look at what data is telling us, that in the 2019-2020 financial year, you're looking at only, 95 companies listed on the JSE. If you look at the trends coming from the Broad-Based Economic Commission, that actually reported, out of that 95, only 70 were compliant, which means there's still a huge number of companies that are not compliant. But when they look deeper into those 70, you'll find that some of the companies that could be complying on paper can't actually point you to a natural person who is black who actually has ownership in that company. What do we say to that? Professor Mohale?
My apologies. I thought we were talking to my president at the BBC. So I think this demonstrates beyond any shadow of doubt that at this current rate, it will take 150 years for the demographics to be broadly reflective of the population. I think women are 51% of the population. Their representations in positions of leadership is 24%. When we talk about the C-suite, black people were 14.3%. Now we celebrate that at 15.2%, and yet they are 90% of the population. Lastly, for me, I was just saying, it's not good that we've increased the enrollment of students from 7% to 11%, but since 2015 through hashtag everything must fall, precipitated by fees must fall, roads must fall, to decolonization, that every year the academic year is disrupted because of exclusion. And yet we have said with NSFAS that anybody that meets both the enrollment but also the funding criteria should never be turned away from education. Yeah. And yet it is those students that are just about to graduate, medical clinicians in their final year of study, who cannot register because they actually do not have money. NSFAS is 7 billion short for first-year students alone, at a time that we need black people who have a degree with an 85% chance of getting employment, actually being employed in their numbers. We spend 50 billion on TVET colleges with 3% completion rate. I think we need to strengthen, to deepen and widen broad-based black economic empowerment rather than questioning its relevance so early on in our democracy.
Sandile Zungu, you can come in here as well. It seems enterprises are still not sold on the idea that for them to grow, they actually need to grow with the society in which they live in, even though that is, of course, part of the Constitution, and they should, by all means, try and align with the laws of the country. They find ways to circumvent that.
Once again, Thabo, thank you so much for having me here. The truth of the matter is that when we achieved our political order, call it liberation, the economic transformation, which was clearly not even worth talking about, has since lagged, and the spirit of Mandela is lost. People no longer see it as an imperative to transform society, to ensure that there is inclusion, to ensure that the centuries and decades of colonialism and apartheid, there is redress. And they've been let off the hook through decades of being soft on a need to transform society. And what you are citing as, call it enterprise bullishness, that they can just avoid transformation because they can. There's no stick. There's no single-mindedness and political will on those who have the power to persuade them to do the right thing in compliance with the laws. And what we are seeing is 27 years into our democracy, and not a single sector in our economy has got majority ownership by black people. Not even financial services, not even construction, where there's been a plethora of changes of ownership. Not even agriculture, which is even below 15%. And not a single sector, even in the transportation sector or automotive sector where you see black ownership of taxis being quite high up. And not even that industry has got sufficient ownership by black people. You cannot have political stability in this country on a sustainable basis unless you can demonstrably show that black people have got a vested economic interest in the ownership and management of the economy. So for me, we should not be having this debate, because if people are really seriously meaning to honor the spirit of Mandela, they should not be arguing against transformation. They should be saying how quickly. It should be about the pace that we should be arguing about. But if you listen to the solidarities of this world and the Afro forums of this world, they're really meaning to challenge every positive step that is taken by government and by any progressive structure that seeks to deepen black participation in the economy, even during these COVID times, which our good professor has eloquently started off as a crisis point in our nation.
Gabriel, Crouse, are we soft on transforming or the need to transform society?
I doubt it. I think if you look at regulation, it's pretty hard to come to that conclusion. You know, one thing to notice is that data about ownership is coming out of a system that is highly unreliable and not actually run by central government, not run by SARS or Stats SA. If you want a good debunking of the equity ownership of black people, read Moeletsi and Becky. The best data that we do have is on incomes, and that comes from Stats SA, from its General Labour Force Survey. And what that shows is, by our estimation, in the 80s, white people earned about 80% of income in the country. By 2006, that had come down to about 50%. By 2015, thereabouts, it had come down to 34%. So black people earned not just a majority, but a supermajority of income since then. If you look at the top 10% of black earners, defined in the BBBEE way, they earned about 33% of national income, whereas the white top 10% earned about 10% of national income. So the thought that there's been no shift is demonstrably false.
So
and
hold
go
on
to
a second.
Stats SA
Let me
to
take
see
you
that.
back. Are you saying the regulator and the data that they have is unreliable?
I am. And like I said, there's a good debunking of this. So if you look at the biggest asset section in the country, it's the pension pot, let's say around 4 trillion rand, let's say around half of all assets. There's no real good qualification of whose hands those assets sit in, broken down by race. If you look at equities, if you invest in a financial instrument which pools your investments together with others, this is standardly defined as white or as not applicable. I mean, you saw the same thing with land, by the way, where 70% of the government's land audit couldn't identify the race of owners. And they only looked at 30% and then sort of extrapolated from that on the basis of, well, we know the rest is all like this. But what is very clear is the income data, which comes out of Stats SA, which shows black people earn about 40% of income, 70% of income, white people about 30%. And as I say, the top 10% of black income earners are getting the lion's share compared to anyone else. Wealth inequality is the highest within black people. The top 10% of black people earned, I did this calculation, something like 48 times more than the bottom 40%. I don't mean per person, I mean as a total quantum. So millions compared to a far smaller number. So the question is, what is BBBEE doing? I think Professor Mohale started out very well as describing South Africa as the place with the worst income inequality in the world. What BBBEE has done is exacerbated that. It's created a handful of black, white, Indian and colored millionaires, multimillionaires and billionaires, and it's left most South Africans out. BBBEE should be replaced by a system that really incentivizes job creation. If you want to know whether BBBEE is responsible for corruption, just ask Gwede Mantashe, who said this thing of buying a water bottle for 7 rand and selling it for 27 rand to try and create a black middle-class person must stop. Ask Praveen Gordhan, who ask who had things to say about Eskom procurement. Eskom procures alone over 100 billion rand a year from black people.
But you're talking about one component of BEE, which is the procurement of government spend. Yeah.
So that's just one side, and that side needs to be dropped and replaced with procurement that's going to incentivize local businesses and not end up offshoring some of the good stuff. I think one of the key steps that needs to be taken is lifting the cap. Currently, there's a cap on how many shares, what proportion of its shares a business can sell to its employees.
I'm going to come back to what steps need to be taken, Gabriel. Let's take a break. We'll come back. Professor Bonang Mohale, Sandile Zungu, Gabriel, Crouse, and Melanie Veness with us in this conversation. Let's take your thoughts on Twitter as well at Newsroom 405 072 110 5584 on the WhatsApp line. We're back in a moment. On the newsfeed late night, you continue now with our conversation, and we're looking at, of course, broad-based black economic empowerment. Is it time to recalibrate, change certain elements, components of it? Joining me in that conversation is the president of the Black Business Council, Sandile Zungu, Free State University Chancellor and Bidvest Independent Non-Executive Chair, Professor Bonang Mohale. We also have writer and analyst at the Institute of Race Relations, Gabriel Crouse, and CEO of the Pietermaritzburg Midlands Chamber of Business, Melanie Veness. Melanie, let's start with you in this segment. I mean, you've said black economic empowerment is the most oppressive policy ever in one of the conversations. You still hold that view?
You know, I think we've got to be honest about I think what we're trying to achieve is exactly what we ought to try and achieve in South Africa. So I think the goal is right. I think that we have to be honest about the results and say what we wanted to achieve is a more equal society, an inclusive society, to alleviate poverty, to make South Africa better for everybody in South Africa. And I think that if we were to assess what we've managed to achieve through we haven't achieved our goals. And I think that you know, I spent 3 weeks in China, courtesy of the Chinese government, the Beijing School of Economics, and they took us through, there were 50 of us from developing countries, through the policy interventions to bring up their economy. And one of the things that really impressed me about China was that China would develop a policy that they thought would have the appropriate results, and then they would test whether the policy, in fact, had those results. And if it didn't, then they would make changes. They wouldn't keep trying to do the same thing to achieve a different result, which doesn't make sense. I think everybody in business can agree that isn't the case. You certainly listen to the investors. I don't think there's a single international B2B meeting that I've ever attended where BEE hasn't been brought up as an issue as far as investment is concerned. And I think we've got to be honest and look at really what is our basket of offering from South Africa. We're a long-haul destination. We're at the bottom end of Africa. Logistically, it's difficult. We have high corporate tax rates relatively, policy uncertainty. We've got political instability. We've got expensive, insecure supply of electricity now. We've got skills shortages. We've got a very high corruption index. We've got a relatively complicated labor environment. So I think that if you look at our basket of offering, should we be complicating that with a policy that makes it unattractive for people to invest in South Africa? It's something that we really want to achieve from a South African perspective. And as I'm saying, let's not change the goal, but let's change the method of achieving that goal. You know, shouldn't we, in my view, we should be looking at incentives, at tax incentives that incentivize people to deliver what we would like them to deliver. Because that way, from a purely investment offering portfolio, we're rolling out the red carpet. We're saying we're competitive. Come and invest in South Africa. This is what, buy into our Madiba dream. This is what we're trying to achieve. And if you actually do this, we will give you massive incentives. It's savings. So people are able to do the elements that they're able to do, as opposed to having a very strict structure that it's difficult to operate in. I think I was watching an interview the other day where the representative of the EU, our biggest trade partner, was saying the ownership element is difficult. So surely it makes sense.
I watched that interview as well, and he says most companies in the EU group feel comfortable, especially smaller companies that are owned by families. Instead of giving ownership, they would rather give skills.
Yeah. shouldn't we accept that? I mean, shouldn't we be looking at it and saying, this is wonderful. Let's grow our economy. Let's put a competitive offering out there so that we can attract investment, so that we can grow this economy. I don't think that we can hope on the projected growth rates that we've got to address our unemployment issues or our inequality without coming up with something that's really quite phenomenal in that space.
All right.
So,
Let's get a response from Sandile Zungu as well as Bonang Mohale to these issues. I mean, the first issue, Sandile, that maybe you must address is the question of the regulators' information being unreliable. Let's rather look at the income patterns in South Africa and black people, not just a majority, but a super majority when it comes to income, earning close to 70% of the income that comes from the country.
Well, the regulators' information have got no basis. I don't think Gabriel has got any basis to discredit it. And instead quote very, dodgy kind of statistics that don't make sense even to himself. I think what he's basically saying is that white people who make up less than 10% of the population of this country account for more than 3 times the income in South Africa today. And he says we need to be proud about that. I think that's optimistic in the first instance. The reality is that white people account for much more than that. And he talks about telecom spending billions on blacks alone. Please. That cannot be true. It's furthest from the truth. There's a tendency for people to confuse BEE-rated companies and say they are now black companies. When we talk about black ownership, we talk about black ownership. We're not talking about a company with level 3 or level 4 ownership on other criteria. And number 2, black people make up more than 75% of the population in this country. And the fact is that they account for just over 10% of wealth in South Africa. White people make up less than 10% of the population. They account for almost 2/3 of the wealth in this country. And people are saying Mandela's vision is that. It cannot be. We cannot allow people to suddenly usurp and own Mandela's vision. Whereas people who were ought to benefiting from Mandela's vision and fight for freedom is ourselves who are saying we're feeling disgruntled by the outcomes as they pertain right now. But I like the way that you coined your question, Thabo. You said, is it not about time that BE is recalibrated? I'm sure people like Gabriel will have preferred that, is it not about the time that BE is abandoned? Recalibration is something that we ought to continuously do, because we do appreciate that possibly the policy is not working at an optimal level of efficacy. And therefore it needs to be tweaked on a continuous basis to ensure that it achieves the intended outcomes of creating and deepening an entrepreneurial class in South Africa who will then create jobs, who will assist the country towards economic growth. That needs to happen on a continuous basis. And therefore one will not be defending the system and saying it's working optimally well. But you cannot disprove it and discredit it on the basis of dubious figures coming from IRR. It's not to be permitted.
Prof Mohale, let's talk then about something else that was raised, the question of wealth inequality being the highest between black people in townships than it is between black and white people in this country.
So I think we should not be led down a rabbit hole and chase red herrings. 27 years into democracy, the children that still cross rivers with school uniforms and their books on top of their heads are black. The children in the middle of winter, freezing cold, that are learning under the trees not in classrooms, are black. The 1,256 pit latrine toilets are found in the Eastern Cape alone, excluding Limpopo, and all of those are absolutely black. 13% of the land was meant to accommodate 90% of the black people in this country. We haven't changed that, and yet we know there is no possession like land. When we say, but the figures can't be reliable, unless you know Tabia Kabinde, the chairperson of the Employment Equity Commission, and Zodwa, who is the chairperson of the BE Commission, more qualified, better, good quality human beings you haven't met yet. And these are the people who share these statistics with us. 2 years ago, it was the 20th anniversary of the employment equity. I think sometimes white people do this deliberately to say, no, but look at our wealth is coming down, because not only did we see an avalanche of skills emigration outside of South Africa because they didn't want to be ruled by black people, but also we saw asset emigration. So they exclude the calculation of those assets. When you say, but no, most pension funds have black people in their numbers. At the time that Liberty Properties built Sentin City, the majority of their pension funds was black people. But Liberty is not owned by black people. The senior people in those pension funds are not black people. Therefore, the people that were earning R1 million and above in managing Sentin City in terms of integrated facilities management were not black people. So I think we should not be distracted. In education, when we say black people have the highest unemployment rate, youth unemployment 24 to 14 years down, it's north of 60 percentage points. And yet if you are a white kid with a university degree, that unemployment rate is less than 4%. So the grotesque inequalities that have been exposed, not created by the pandemic, must be acknowledged. And I think the best thing that we can do as South Africans is to join hands and say, when your neighbor is hungry, you are the one that cannot sleep at night. Lastly, when we say, the example of China is to retweak and recalibrate, that's true. But that's what we've been doing in South Africa. 2003, BEE, 2007, Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment Act, years later, Code of Good Practice. We continuously tweak it. Just because some aspects of it are not working, it's no reason to throw the baby with the bathwater. By the way, our BEE was stolen from the Bumiputra experience in Malaysia, was borrowed from how Canada employed women in the highest levels of the legislature. It was borrowed from how Singapore moved itself from absolutely nowhere to being among the top 5 economies in the world, even in China. For 12 consecutive 5-year terms, they've been chasing only two things only: personal safety and energy security. For 60 years, that's what they've been doing, and they haven't even reviewed that. So I think we shouldn't be selective. Let's accept that poverty, like the pandemic, like the ESCOM's rolling blackouts, still has a black and feminine face. Thank you, my dear brother.
Right, let's take a break. We'll get a response from the other panelists when we come back. The newsfeed late night continues for you. By the way, we can take your tweets as well. Newsroom 405 on WhatsApp. You can send your comments and your questions tonight. 072-110-5584. We're back in a minute. Welcome back. The newsfeed late night continues in conversation tonight with the Black Business Council President and Amazulu FC Chair Sandile Zungu, Free State University Chancellor and Bidvest Independent Non-Executive Chair Professor Bonang Mohale, writer and analyst of the Institute of Race Relations Gabriel Crouse, and the CEO of the Pietermaritzburg Midlands Chamber of Business Melanie Veness. And you, of course, are tweeting us tonight at Newsroom 405 or WhatsApp your questions and comments on 072-110-5584. The conversation is on BBBEE tonight. Melanie, I saw you shaking your head there. You want to jump in and just respond to essentially what the two gentlemen are raising, that if you look at the picture, let's be honest, the face of poverty in South Africa is still black.
Yeah, well, I've got to say, I work for an NGO out of choice because I want to contribute to South Africa. So from where I'm sitting, there are a lot of people that have benefited hugely from BBBEE. And my question is, should people of a certain wealth level still be benefiting from BBBEE, or should it be something that is saying that people on the ground are actually benefiting to some degree? I also want to say that I think, we've got to be able to have honest conversations. I agree completely with Bonang about the inequality in the townships, the absolute unacceptability that the poorest people live furthest away and have the worst schooling and have the least access to opportunities. I couldn't agree more. But what I don't agree on is that we found the silver bullet that can solve that problem. And really what I'm asking is that we sit down and pragmatically look at what those results are saying, because the view that we have of South Africa now, it's not acceptable. It's more unequal than it ever has been before. And there are some models that we could employ and look at. Government procurement is a massive area where we really are not using that procurement to grow entrepreneurs, to reach people on the ground. The Chilean government had a phenomenal program some years ago. Actually, they ran it through the National Chamber. And aspirant business people would go into the chamber, register, the chamber helped them get all their documentation in order. And then they would go online to a national procurement system. If there was something in the country that suited their level of skills, then they would get a notification electronically. It rotated. And then people were assessed on their performance. And when they were at a certain level, they could engage with the chamber and say, I'm at level 3 or level 4, whatever, I'd like to do some training. And then the funding was found to give them training and then to assess their increase in competency. And so you're growing actual entrepreneurs and skills. At the moment, as far as government procurement is concerned, we're growing opportunists because, when you speak to people, they say they're business people, but actually they are stationery suppliers, pothole fillers, T-shirt manufacturers, water providers. They're jacks of all trade. They're responding to government needs as opposed to actually growing sustainable businesses. And I think there needs to be this greater partnership between the private sector and government to say, let's start with this. They grew their SMME market phenomenally because also then you're developing a trusted database the private sector can use to access to say, look at the great ratings this business has got. They're at the level and competency level that I require for my services here. It's easy for me to be able to utilize them and then rate them so that you grow their business responsibly and with the attention that is needed, so people don't get lost in the system. I think there has to be a better way of us doing that. I just don't think we're doing it well enough.
Gabriel, you cannot discount the regulators' statistics conveniently because they just don't suit the picture that you want to present around BBBEE. And in fact, BBBEE might not be working essentially in certain elements, but should not be discarded completely. I'm just summarizing what comes from the two gentlemen. What's your response?
I guess let's rather just discount Stats SA, call it dodgy, that's fine. I think it is interesting what happened. You asked Professor Mohale, what do you make of inequality, wealth inequality, income inequality within the black group? And what you got was an answer speaking to half of that equation. Black people in this country are disproportionately overrepresented amongst the poorest of the poor, amongst the most neglected, also amongst the most shot, also amongst the most victimized by crime, also the most victimized by a bad education system, and so on and so forth. But inequality has two sides. Black wealth is the thing that BBBEE proponents just don't want to talk about. They don't want to talk about how BBBEE has worked, how many multimillionaires and billionaires it's created, how many kleptocrats, how well it has functioned to incubate corrupt practices. Because the way the BBBEE narrative works is you say, look, poor black people are in their numbers. So we need to give more money to black people. And let's not look who gets it. Let's not pay attention to how the Cater network works. And by the way, the people who benefit from BEE are not all black. Yeah. Many of them are white. If you if you look at Gangster State, if you look at My President's Keepers, if you read City Press, you'll find lots of stories, harrowing stories, about white people who have joined the rainbow oligopoly cartel, I like to call it, who've taken that opportunity basically to steal from the poor by redirecting money towards themselves that should have gone to the poor. And, I think the lack of pragmatism is telling, and it's shocking.
But
one simple thing is
precisely the reason why BEE policies are not implemented the way that they should be, because we keep talking past each other, where issues are being raised about ownership, and the IIR says, well, look at black wealth and look at how unequal people are in the township because they are black billionaires that were created by BEE. But when the facts are also saying, well, in terms of the ownership of companies in South Africa, they are still pretty much lily white, and that ownership pattern has not changed. And so we are never moving forward to come up with ways of transforming the economy, but just keep talking at the top of each other's heads.
Well, I dispute the wealth statistics. I say that the regulators' wealth statistics are incomplete. And as I've said, you can go online, look it up, and you'll find solid arguments for this. This is not about whose credentials are higher. It's about the method that they use for establishing it. And like I said, the same method effectively was used by the National Land Count audit, where it identified the racial ownership of 30% of land and couldn't identify the racial ownership of 70% of land. If you look at financial instruments, it's quite hard, not just in South Africa, but around the world, to find out who sits behind the company that owns the assets. And so sometimes that'll mean that you're underestimating white wealth, and sometimes that'll mean you're underestimating black wealth. The thing that I'm trying to argue comes out of Institute of Race Relations polling. We find that 80% of South Africans don't care what color their employee or employer is. Their preference over a BEE system is an employment growth system. The number one priority is to grow jobs. And I'm trying to understand why so many South Africans who don't get to come on TV, who don't have professorships, who don't have fancy lifestyles, why do so many ordinary South Africans think that way? And my supposition is that ordinary South Africans think that way because they're not bamboozled. Yeah. They see that BEE has produced a few mega wealthy individuals, and that it's come alongside a lot of mismanagement. They also see that when things go wrong and people get fired or people get caught out for not doing their jobs, the first thing that happens is they blame racism. They say, you're just accusing me. This was Zuma's tactic. This was the tactic of all his allies, and it's something that we're now seeing repeat itself. It hasn't gone away. And they think to themselves, this fixation on race is getting in the way of me. I'm poor. Help me because I'm poor. Help me because I'm uneducated. Give me a better schooling opportunity. Help me because I can't afford private security, so I have to rely on the police, but they don't come when I call, and when they do, sometimes they shoot me. Okay. I think South Africans are more concerned with poverty and addressing poverty. And poverty doesn't have a race. Poverty has a hungry belly. None of us on this call have a hungry belly, although we're a very diverse panel.
Gabriel,
poverty is about desperation.
Let's stick with that point. 80%, Professor Mohale, of South Africans that were polled by the IRR, they don't care about the color of the employer. They just want a job, because poverty does not have a color. If I am poor and I'm unemployed, all I care about is to get a job.
So it can't be true, because this is what we've been talking about, to say the chances of finding the majority of people as a group who are poor, marginalized, disenfranchised, subjugated, black. The chances of finding white people as a group who are wealthy, who are middle class, who are top-end earners, who are managers, are white. 79% of the C-suite, it's white people. So, you see, we shouldn't be sidetracked when we raise these issues as sharply as we do, and then people's response when we say, but you know what, black people have been subjected to 350 years of racism. Some white people say, no, but we have black racists too. The definition of racism, to make a point, is you must inherently believe in your superiority, you must have power and use it to exclude. A good test says, what is it that white people have prevented black people as a group from doing? 1,001 things. You ask the question to say, what is it that black people as a group have excluded and prevented white people from doing as a group? Absolutely nothing. So I think when we speak about, no, but I don't trust the statistics, it's like saying, is the RDP a perfect plan? Is the NDP 2030 a perfect plan? The answer is no, it's work in progress. You don't have to have a perfect plan before you start implementing, fine-tuning, and tweaking it. Don't confuse bribery, stealing, and cheating, state capture, industrial-scale looting with broad-based black economic empowerment.
Let's come in there. We'll come back in a moment because I've got to take a break. Professor Bonang Mohale, Sandile Zungu, Gabriel, Crouse, as well as Melanie, Veness. We'll come back after the break and we'll wrap up this conversation with you tonight on the Newsfeed Late Night. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Newsfeed Late Night. Our conversation continues now on black economic empowerment. Is it due for a recalibration? What has worked? What doesn't work, and what needs to happen? Are we talking past each other on the essential matters that we need to be addressing here on this question of broad-based economic empowerment? We've got with us the Black Business Council President and Amazulu FC Chair Sandile Zungu, Free State University Chancellor, and Bidvest Independent Non-Executive Chair Professor Bonang Mohale, writer and analyst at the Institute of Race Relations, Gabriel Crouse, and the CEO of the Pietermaritzburg Midlands Chamber of Business, Melanie Veness. Bob Zungu, let me bring you in here on this issue that has come up over and over again, the question of procurement, right? Let's rather look at dealing, for example, with the corruption in procurement and ensuring that actually we use that to empower more SMEs, and that would be a much better transformation than to obsess with ownership, because even as the EU says, ownership is a very difficult thing to do. Let's rather look at procurement, because that will start more SMEs and see how we move them through that process in terms of enterprise development, but also in terms of skills development.
Well, let me start where I should be ending and say BEE, broad-based black economic empowerment, is here today, as the President has said. We in the Black Business Council shall not take our foot off the pedal. There's a need for the economy to transform. There's a need for continuous retweaking and recalibration that we are committed to. That's why Professor Mohale eloquently said there's been transformation over the years, including the ever-changing codes of good practice. The arguments that people like Gabriel are making are tried arguments in right-wing and racist circles, and is not worthy of responding to them. When it talks about public procurement, I think the point that Melanie is making is absolutely correct. It's worth exploring. How can government effectively use its massive procurement budget and spend to move the needle? We in the Black Business Council have been complaining that the PPPFA, Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act, is an impediment to effective leverage by the state to transform the economy. And we have called for the change of that. The public procurement bill will urge the President to move on that, because the vacuum is just unseemly. Corruption is the biggest impediment to the interests of the poor in this country. But correctly, you cannot use procurement in the same sentence as transformation, as if these are twins, Siamese twins. You know, the procurement, the corruption that has come with international consulting agencies. I mean, it's an open secret that McKinsey has accepted responsibility in some quarters. Bain & Company is subject of Zondo Commission. And unfortunately, in South Africa, The institutions like our South African Institute of Race Relations will not use its influence responsibly to call for the redlining and the blacklisting of those entities. Why? Because they're not worthy of putting pressure on them. The pressure must be applied on those who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of real empowerment, such as black people. Black people have been victims of systemic and systematic subjugation over centuries and decades. And that has got to be addressed. And trust me, for so long as the Black Business Council is there, there's got to be an ongoing and everlasting commitment to transform the economy.
Here's a question for you coming through on WhatsApp tonight, Babu Zungu, that I think you need to tackle. It speaks of the issues, I suppose, that talk about the tracking of how successful we are as far as this policy is concerned. Let's have a look at what some of your questions are saying tonight on WhatsApp. This question is from Kulu, I believe so, if I can see it on the screen, because I can't see it at this point. I'm trying to get to it.
Well,
what measures are used to measure revenue benefits on BBBEE?
Well, I mean, if you're picking just that one measurable issue, we can pick 25 others. But for brevity, because it's not the whole day workshop, I can actually point out that the ownership of the economy is heavily skewed in favor of the minority of white South Africans. The management of the economy is heavily dominated by white males. Even in terms of wealth ownership, African people who make up more than 70% of the population account for just over 10% of all wealth in this country. And white people make up for a disproportionate ownership of the economy. And if you just focus on those standards, you'll actually see that we've got a long way to go. And what we should be doing, we should be trying to find each other to see where is the tweaking and where is the agency, and where are we failing in our current system, and tweak that. But to argue that there's nothing as oppressive as BE is quite insulting, and we cannot be pleased with that. And we actually feel very much offended. We fought for this liberation, and at the end, at the current moment, a lot of our people are feeling marginalized. And for people who come from right-wing or liberal kind of lines, to argue that we should be satisfied with just having an RDP roof over our head, we should be satisfied with having a job opportunity, not even sustainable quality jobs, it is an affront to what we fought for. We fought for ownership of the means of production. And critical to that is the issue of ownership of the economy. I won't even talk about land, because that's not the issue for debate today.
All right.
But the fact of the matter is that we have got a long way to go, and to entertain racist arguments at this time of the evening is very unfortunate.
Let's have a look at more coming through from the social media tonight. And Prof Bonang, this one is from Tabo in Soweto. And this is, I suppose, the most painful part whenever we talk of BEE, that it's only working for a few. He says the BBBEE is just on paper. It has so far not yielded any positive results. It needs to be scrapped. It's working for only a few. How do we get from working for only a few to working for a majority of people who need to be getting the benefit from it?
So when you look at the definition of broad-based black economic empowerment, it says the intent is to peculate the benefits to the majority of black people. When we speak about this notion of an inclusive economic growth, we are very explicit about who needs to be included. It's more women and more black people. When we say the best way of empowering black people, instead of taking them to training, most companies, you just see a black person and say, how can I train? And you never graduate. And whenever you think SME, you think in township economy, black people. They never graduate. We forget that Rembrandt and Altron were SMEs at some stage, but they were allowed to graduate. The best, most powerful thing that we can do is to give the 3.5 million people of Soweto title deeds. That's expropriation without compensation. The best that we can do, because with this title deed on Tuesday, they can go on Friday and leverage it and start small and medium enterprises. The biggest impediment to black people owning their own businesses and hiring their own children rather than sending them to a different neighborhood to go on their knees and ask for a job from somebody else, it's lack of finance and access to finance. Yeah. I think the best that we can do is to continue to monitor and track. And by the way, State SAA is monitoring and tracking. It is run by a consummate professional, Ntate Maluleka, who took over from Padi Lehohla. They are more qualified than most 10 people put together. And the Employment Equity Commission, they are monitoring. The BE Commission, they are monitoring the means of ownership. We are, the Black Management Forum is monitoring. Yeah. The Black Business Council, my president, they are monitoring. They spend their life monitoring this. Yeah. It's not right that 27 years into democracy, only 3 companies of the top 40 listed on the JSE are run by women. Right. It can be sustainable.
Now, Tate Mohale, one of the economists was quoted here today as one maybe we should look at when it comes to triple BE. That is Ntate Mohale Tsimbeki, who said we need a new system to get people to build things instead of acquiring. What do you say to that?
I agree with him absolutely, but also the other part that he says in the same article. He says we should spend our infrastructure budget on the productive side of the economy, not on consumption. He further down says, 16 million people gainfully employed pre-COVID can support 18 million people that are on social security. I think for us, more than anything else, we should look at the opportunities that are presented by probably the 3 trillion debt, now going to 5 trillion debt, and to say, are we better utilizing it? For me, the things that needs to be done to get us out of this fiscal crisis, more than anything else, is to send the top state capture miscreants to jail, so that we don't give people excuses that all black people know is to steal, pillage, and industrial scale looting. We need to secure.
I am out of time. Unfortunately, we're going to have to just wrap it here. But Melanie, just final word. How do we move from broad-based black economic empowerment to being seen as broad-based white exclusion?
Look, I mean, I don't think that is the issue here. I mean, for me, I'm looking at our economy and I'm saying we want exactly the same outputs and outcomes as Bonang and my colleague at the Black Business Council are wanting. At the end of the day, we want a more equal society in South Africa that is there for everybody that lives here. In a current form, BE is not delivering that because we have problems, and unless we can put the other arguments aside and say really what is working for our people and what's not working for our people, can we be critically assessing it without saying that there's some kind of undertone of racism? Because in my heart of hearts, that's what I want as an outcome. I know, and they all know, that it's not working for people on the ground. You can just listen to the messages that come out of our township areas. How do we take the end goal that we all agree we need to attain, and how do we put a strategy in place that allows us to better attain that? Let's not hang on to stuff doggedly and say, well, we're going to insist this is the way it's got to. We need a new form. There's no two ways about it. It's not working for our people. So my plea is just to say, can we sit around a table? Can we critically assess what we've got in place? Can we be honest about what it is and isn't achieving? And can we look at a new way of achieving that end goal?
Let's leave it there tonight. Appreciate your time. Professor Bonang Mohale, Sandile Zungu, Gabriel, Crouse, and Melanie Veness.